it's time to talk about an extraordinarily common, often used, and pretty neat concept. An immediately invoked function expression, or an IIFE, an IIFE. What are immediately invoked function expressions? How do they work? And why are they useful? Let's look. So we've already seen the difference between function statements and function expressions. A function statement happens as a new statement where function is the first word, either on a new line, maybe after a semicolon. Function, let's say greet, it takes a name, and then let's say I just output that name, just for starters. So that's a statement. When JavaScript sees this, it puts it into memory, but when it begins to execute, when it comes to this line, it doesn't really execute anything. You actually have to invoke it for it to execute. So we know that, and the function's already in memory. Then we have a function expression. For example, I can use a function expression to set a variable equal to it, and I can have an anonymous function like this, and maybe it's the same function essentially. So I've got another greeting function. This is an expression. It isn't put into memory initially, but rather during execution, and when it hits this line of code, the JavaScript engine, it creates this function object on the fly, and then we can invoke it using a variable that's pointing to that memory location. So we've seen that this is a function statement, and this is using a function expression. So we've seen that this is a kind of a function literal in this case, where I'm creating the function on the fly, I'm creating an object, just like I might a string or a number. And I have that object at this point in the code. Now, what's the special thing we can do with functions, with all functions, that make it a special kind of object? Well, it has a code property, and what can we do with that code property? We can invoke it. We've already invoked it here, and invoked it here, but we can invoke it on the fly. So let me run this first. And I'll just put it in the console. And we have hello undefined, because I haven't passed a variable to it. So let's just say John. And then I'll put John. And both behave the same way. But I could, instead of calling this greet function here, I could set a value. Let's say var greeting equal to function name, and let's give it the same exact function body, so a very similar equivalent object that I'm creating. And in this case, I'm going to invoke the function at the point where I create it. Do you see that? This gives me an object, a function object. So when this part is done evaluating, I have a function object. And what do I do to invoke a function? I put parentheses. This invokes the function immediately after creating it. And so this is an immediately invoked function expression, or an IIFE, an IIFE. This is a function expression, and I'm invoking it or running it immediately after I create it. So, although it sounds complex, it's just describing exactly what I'm doing. I'm immediately invoking here this function expression. So let's say that this instead returns a value. What am I going to get in this greeting variable? Well, if I made it only a function expression by itself, and then I console.log this greeting, it's going to be what? It's going to be a function. And then I could invoke it to get the proper value. Hello undefined. I could invoke it with a parameter, and then I get a better value there. But if instead I invoke it here, what's going to happen? Well, the function object will be created using the function expression. Then it will be invoked, that is called or run, and that value will be returned. And then that will be set equal to greeting. So when I console.log greeting in this case, I get hello undefined. So I need to give it a value, and here is where I call the function, so I need to pass it a parameter. So I can pass it John right there. Do you see what's happening? I'm creating the function, then I'm calling the function like I would any function, and I pass it the parameters. It expects a name, so I give it that name parameter. And then I refresh, and it's the same. But notice that greeting holds the string, not the function. If I tried to invoke it, it's going to error. String is not a function. You see? Greeting contains a string now, because I invoked this function, and it returned a string. So this is an immediately invoked function expression. And it lets me run the function at the point that I create it. And although it looks a little weird, it's actually pretty simple when you think about it. Let's give ourselves a little bit of space here. Again, look at it. Look at it carefully. I created a function on the fly that accepts a parameter. I run that function, I call that function, I invoke that function and pass the parameter immediately after creating it. And I get the result of the function. And that's what goes into greeting. That's what gets passed to the equals operator. So that's useful. But even more interesting is if I just have a standalone immediately invoked function expression. And that goes to expressions in general. Let's scroll down this a little bit and give ourselves some room. I could put a line of code at the end of this. It's perfectly valid and looks kind of strange. I'll put a semicolon to make sure the syntax parser understands this is one line of code. The number 3. Am I going to get an error? Nope. No errors at the end. This is a valid JavaScript expression. Remember, it can just run an expression, and it doesn't have to store in a variable or anything. It just is there. It runs it, it executes it, and that's it. I just chose not to do anything with it. So I could do that. I could do I am a string. Just sitting there, doing nothing. See? I refresh, no error. That's valid. I'm not doing anything with it, but it's valid. How about an object? I could create an object using object literal syntax, and it's just sitting there. It's a line of code in this file that's being executed, and no errors. It's a valid JavaScript statement and expression. So I can do strings, I can do numbers. What about functions? Well, if I was to do, let's say I took this function and made it stand alone. What's the problem here? If I want this to be a function expression, where it's creating it on the fly, do you see the problem? If I run this, it says, hey, unexpected token parenthesis. Why? Because the syntax parser saw the word function as the beginning of a new line or a new segment of code, It was after the semicolon here. So it expects that this is a function statement. It wants it to have a name. It can't be anonymous. So this syntax is a problem. If I just put function, this isn't a function expression. It's a function statement. My normal kind of just write a function, the way you've probably first learned to do. But that's not what I want. I want it to just sit there, kind of like a 3, or I am a string, or something like that. So how do we trick the syntax parser into understanding that I don't intend this to be a function statement? Well, I need to make sure that the word function isn't the first thing it sees on this new line of code. If it isn't the first character on this new line of code, if it isn't the first word, then it's not a problem. The syntax parser will understand, oh, this can't be a function statement because a function statement has to be the first thing. The first word of a function statement has to be the word function. So how can I do this? Well, there's a few ways to do it, actually. But the most accepted, because it's the easiest to read and look at, and it's the least amount of typing, is to wrap your function in parentheses. This is when you want a function expression instead of a normal function statement that you might be used to. Parentheses inside JavaScript, remember, is an operator. And you only use parentheses with expressions, like 3 plus 4 times 2, or something like that, where I'm grouping. It's the grouping operator. You never put a statement inside parentheses, like if something. It always is an expression, something that returns a value. So since the JavaScript engine knows that anything inside a parenthesis must be an expression, it assumes that this function that you've written is a function expression, that you're creating this function object on the fly. And if I run this, once again, I have no errors. See that? I have a function just sitting there, doing nothing. And I'm not using it, but it's valid syntax. All right, here's the fun part. Let's say I change this to a console.log hello name, or maybe I'll just be a little bit more verbose. I'll do a greeting equals hello, and then I'll put greeting plus space and the name that I pass it. So now I have a function that does some work, creates some variables. I'd like to run this. Remember when we had just like 3 sitting there, it didn't do anything, or I am a string. It still put it in memory, but then it was kind of lost. I never did anything with it. But what's special about a function object, remember? I can invoke it. So after I see the function, I can invoke it. This also is an immediately invoked function expression, and most often what we're talking about when we say that phrase. A function expression wrapped in parentheses so that the JavaScript engine understands that I don't mean this to be my kind of normal function statement. I mean this to be an expression, something that's created on the fly when this line of code is executed. I wrap it in parentheses just to trick the syntax parser. And then I put parentheses to actually run it. So I'm creating a function and running it all at the same time. And I can pass values to it. For example, if I have var first name, and that's John, I can pass first name. Take a good look at that. I have a function expression. I wrapped it in parentheses to trick the syntax parser. And because it knows that this is a function expression, it creates this object on the fly, and it's invocable because it's a function. And I can pass values to it. So then, what am I going to get? What's going to happen when this line of code is run? Well, let's say inside IIFE, just so we can see the difference. See that? Did you see what just happened? I just wrapped all my code in a function, created it on the fly, and invoked it. This is the classic example of an IIFE, an IIFE, immediately evoked function expression. This turns out to be a wonderful tool in your arsenal as a JavaScript developer. And you'll see this form, this style, in almost every major framework and library that's out there today. So take a look at this code. Try to write it yourself. Get familiar with it. Add some extra parameters and pass them in. Understand that we're just executing code on the fly. We're just executing a function after we create it. And now we'll see just why that's so useful. Oh, one more thing before we go. There's a bit of a controversy about which syntax to use. Everyone agrees to use parentheses, but you could invoke it inside the parentheses, or you could invoke it outside the parentheses. It doesn't really matter. Both work the same way. So which one's the right way? The answer is, there is no right way. It's whichever one seems to make the most sense to you. A lot of people think this makes the most sense because you're simply encapsulating the whole thing in parentheses. I think it's arguable. It's more of an artistic choice. But whatever you do, pick one and be consistent so you don't cause yourself trouble in the long run. All right, let's move on.